I'm Tom Crummell, co-director of the Biodesign program and also chair of the board at the Fogarty Institute. And on behalf of Paul Yock, Gordon Saul, Tom Fogarty, Casey McGlynn, and a host of others, it's a privilege to welcome you all tonight. Delighted so many of you could join us for the annual From the Innovators Workbench series, which this particular episode is also a Tracy Lefteroff Memorial event. We'll talk about Tracy in a minute, but it features a longtime friend of Tom Fogarty's, Dr. Peter Farrell, who's founder, executive chairman of Resmed, a global leader in respiratory management. Mick Farrell, the CEO, and parenthetically, Peter's son had to cancel because of an illness, but I'm confident that Peter will be able to carry on ably. We launched the Innovators Workbench series in 2003 to enable you, our greater community, to learn from people that have done it right, that have done it consistently, and to extract lessons from their successes. Each event has featured a prominent innovator who's made a major impact in their particular area, and the lessons that they've learned from that very dynamic process is very much what David Cassak is able to draw out in this question and answer discussion format. Our past speakers have been a literal who's who in the medical technology innovation space. As I indicated earlier, this is also the Tracy Lefteroff Memorial event. Many of you know Tracy as a pivotal figure in medical technology investment at PwC. He was on the board at the Fogarty Institute and was a valued supporter and advisor to Biodesign, the Fogarty Institute, and to many of us here. We honor and acknowledge him, and I think we all feel his presence. When Tracy passed at a way too early age, a fund was raised both to support this event and also to support a summer internship at the Fogarty Institute, which is an immersive, innovative education process for high school, college, and graduate students. We've had another spectacular summer and a new group of kids coming to the Fogarty Institute this summer, and for those of you that are interested, we can tell you more. And again, it's a pleasure and a privilege to have Dr. Fogarty here with us this evening. But before we get started, a quick reminder, the next Innovator Workbench series is April 25th, and Mike Mahoney, chairman and CEO of a little company called Boston Scientific, will be here. In particular, I'd like to extend gratitude to Tom Fogarty, the Fogarty Institute, and Casey McGlynn at Wilson Sonsini for their continued support, and we're all delighted that Dr. Peter Farrell is here to visit with us. Peter is the founder of Resmed, chairman and CEO since 1989. Many of you know that Resmed is a San Diego-based company that develops, manufactures, and distributes medical equipment for the diagnosis, management, and treatment of sleep, breathing disorders, and other respiratory problems. As we learned from Peter this afternoon, the current stats are 6,000 employees, 5,000 patents, $2.2 billion in revenues, a market cap of $9 billion, and Peter assures me they're just getting started. Peter has 30 years in the medical technology world, was VP for R&D at Baxter, and is a recipient of multiple awards, recognitions, and honors. He holds a bachelor's and a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney and MIT, and a PhD in bioengineering from the University of Washington. In addition to his prodigious accomplishments, it's fair to say that Peter has a long track record of commitment to academic programs in bioengineering and innovation, with advisory roles at Harvard, UCSD, and the University of New South Wales. For those of you that have been to this series, you know that David Cassak, the co-founder and managing partner at Innovation in Medtech, is our host and interviewer par excellence. David has more than 30 years of experience in the healthcare industry and interacts frequently with medical device industry. More importantly, he publishes the Medtech Strategist, required reading for anyone in the field. His insights and style are both legendary and priceless. Please welcome both David Cassak and Peter Farrell, and take it away, guys.
Thanks, Tom. Well, we're really fortunate to have Peter here. I think we did our first article on Resmed, gosh, it must be 15 or 16 years ago. And you'll find, I know over the course of the evening, Peter to be just a wonderful raconteur. But before we get to the Resmed story itself, I think we should begin with a short discussion about sleep apnea, if I might describe what Resmed does. That most of the companies, most of the folks that we have had on this stage deal with clinical problems and clinical issues that are well known, well appreciated. The rationale for treating them seems very clear. That's not necessarily true with sleep apnea. Can you begin by describing why sleep apnea is such a serious problem and condition, and perhaps offer some thoughts as to why it's so underserved and its clinical issues and comorbidities so underappreciated?
You know, that's it's a tough question. Maybe before I get onto that, I'd just like to acknowledge Tracy Lefterhoff, who was just a wonderful guy, and I know he's a very good friend of Dr. Fogarty, and what a sad loss. I mean, it's just awful. And I would also like to pay tribute to Dr. Bill Dement, who's in the audience, and point out that modern-day sleep medicine began at Stanford in 1969, 1970, and Bill is an icon, and Dr. Palaio is here, and a visiting professor, Dr. Maya Krieger from Yale. How did they invite you here, Maya? Anyway, no, that's but the whole, and Bill and his team started polysomnography. And Bill, if I hope I didn't get this wrong, but I can remember you telling me a number of years ago that in a way you were sorry that you started polysomnography because it sort of became a bit of a roadblock because of the EEG and looking at the surrogate impact of sleep disordered breathing and sleep apnea is what you see in the EEG and also with the pulse oximeter. In fact, with a history and a physical, and just simply measuring flow and pressure at the nares, you could do a pretty good diagnosis. Anyway, what was your question?
My question is, in a nutshell,
do we have any time left? No.
If sleep apnea is so critical an issue, why is it so underappreciated?
Well, let me step back. I used to be an academic and joined, I won't make this a long story, but joined Baxter Healthcare to set up and run their R&D in Japan. And so at the time I was foundation director of the Graduate School for Biomedical Engineering, and I got recruited to the University of New South Wales from UW in Seattle in the late 1890s, I think it was. Anyway, I left academe and then went to live in Tokyo, and Baxter, when I was finishing up there after I set up and ran it for about 3 years and then lived there half that time, and they said, well, why don't you set up another Baxter Center for Medical Research? And the mission was to look for low-hanging fruit that Baxter's financial and marketing muscle could take to world markets. And so this is in the, it was around the mid-80s, 86, and so we started with a lot of gene jockey stuff like acute myeloid leukemia, and we were working with a group at the University of Melbourne, Gus Nossel, who actually did spend some time at Stanford here for what that's worth, but sure he picked up quite a bit, and working on porcine islet cells for diabetes, and I'd had some exposure to peritoneal and hemodialysis, and Baxter had $1 billion business in that area. And one of the guys that I was working with, and we were looking for this low-hanging fruit and so forth, and a guy came to me, and it was June of 1986, and so 30 plus years ago, and he said to me, listen, there's this guy at the University of Sydney Medical School, and his name is Colin Sullivan, and he's treating snoring sickness with a reverse vacuum cleaner. And I kind of rolled on my back like a sprayed cockroach. And I thought, what? He said, no, the guy seems credible. He's an MD, PhD. He'd worked for some guru at the University of Toronto for a couple of years. And Elliot Phillipson was the guy's name, who turned out wrote editorials for the New England Journal of Medicine, etc. So I went to see Colin, and he said, I want you to sit in that chair. I'm going to show you a video. And I said, okay. So I sat in a chair, and he showed me the guy like a sumo wrestler on his back going. And then he had HP tracings on the sort of heart rate and blood pressure. And the guy would go into an apnea, and the blood pressure and heart rate would drop, sit there for a while, and then boom, explode. And I watched a series of these. And he said to me, do you think that's good for him? And I said, let's move to the next question. So,
Did you know that what he was talking about was sleep apnea, or did he know? Or did he think that he was really addressing snoring? And I guess, do snoring and sleep apnea correlate?
He was an ICU guy. So he's a pulmonologist.
Right.
And he was treating a lot of truck drivers. They'd come in, and the guys would be cyanotic, and he'd slap oxygen on them. And so he'd watched a lot of this. And of course, PAP therapy has been around in hospitals for decades, where it was a full face mask. You slap it on the subject, and you'd get the fluid out of the lungs and the pleura and so forth, and it was pretty effective. And he showed me what he was using. It was like a reverse toilet seat that he put on this guy's face, and you'd go like this, how's that? Still leaking? How's that? And the insight was a nasal mask and not a full face mask.
Right.
Because everybody said, oh, the air's all going to blow out of the mouth. But if you pressurize the schnozer, you sort of automatically close your mouth, because the air gushing out is very inconvenient. Now, if you've got, a blocked nose or whatever, then you're going to open your mouth, otherwise you won't be there. But so roughly 75 to 80% of people will automatically close their mouths once you pressurize the schnozer. Mm-hmm. And that was the insight. And
so you took that idea to Baxter, and what was their response?
Well, no, there was a guy I worked with at Baxter. His name was Will Peary. He was an engineer, and he used to work with American Hospital Supply. And he said to me, whenever you get into anything new, remember the fatal four first theory. He said, get to that boundary condition where you hope something's going to work. Minimal amount of money, minimal amount of time and effort. And if it works, then you put in the big bucks and the time and effort. So I said to Colin, how many people do you think suffer from this? And he said, oh, look, I don't know. He said, I think it's got to be at least 2% of the population.
Right.
I said, my God. And I'm coming from Baxter, where we had less than 0.2% of the population on dialysis, and we had $1 billion business. So as an MIT-educated engineer, I went 1 billion, 0.2 to 10 billion. I thought, hell, even if it's only 50% of that, that's a big market. And Baxter knew something about it back here in Chicago.
Were there any commercially available treatments for sleep apnea at the time?
There was a small company in Pittsburgh called Respironics that had just started, and they tried to cut a deal with Colin, and they offered him some, pathetic amount of money, and he said, forget about it. So they just said, well, okay, we'll just start doing it anyway, which is what they did. So you bring this idea to Will Peary, who was American Hospital Supply's head of kind of physician-preferred specialty products. Now he's working in Baxter. Maybe there's an angle here we should point out. This is just when Baxter's bought American Hospital Supply, and they suddenly are a major hospital supply distributor. Right. So, and if you're going and talking to Baxter, so there was a guy in Chicago whose name was Vito Manone, who was running their respiratory home care division. And I thought, oh, well, that's good. There's a parking spot for it if I put money into this sort of thing. And it sounded like something that was worth putting a few shekels into. And so I called Vito, and he said, oh, yeah, the nasal CPAP. They'd bought a couple of Respironics devices, and he was aware of it. And he said, oh, yeah, if we can make our own, yeah, why not? Yeah, let's go for it. And a couple of months later, maybe 3 or 4 months later, I'm reading I think it was Clinica publication, and Baxter sells off respiratory home care division. I went, what the hell? So I fly to Chicago, and I sit down with a bunch of guys, and I said, listen, this could be a $10 million business in 3 years. And they were yawning and their eye rolling into it was almost like they couldn't care less. So on the plane on the way back to Sydney, I thought, if we don't buy this, it's dead in the water. So I called Jim Tobin, who was then the president of Baxter, and I said, Jim, look, this is just crazy, it's going to die. And I said, I think there's something there. He said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, look, you guys keep 30% equity and the other 70% I'll divvy up with guys. I said, we'll do it above board, we're all going to pay for our shares and all that sort of thing. And he said, no equity. I said, oh, God.
No equity for you guys or no equity for Baxter?
For Baxter. He didn't want equity. And I said, oh, okay. I said, well, look, we'll cut a check for $500,000. This is around 1988. We'll cut a check for $500,000 and pay you royalties, 5% net profit after tax for the next 100 years or something. And he said to me, all right, under one condition. And I said, well, what's that? He said, when you're next through Chicago, I want you to buy me a beer. And I said, well, wait a minute, Jim, are we talking import or domestic? and it was done in 3 weeks.
So Baxter had funded the original development of this technology. Did Baxter still have royalties to Resmed's technology?
They did. They don't now.
They don't now.
No, they don't.
So it wasn't.
So it wasn't. It didn't work out all that well for them. I sort of was still, for whatever reason, important to them in the kidney, the dialysis, peritoneal hemodialysis area. So they cut a 5-year consultancy with me, so I could pay myself peppercorn salary, and we raised money from friends. And the reason we're in the People's Republic of California is that Medtronic invested in us, and they said, we'd like you to work they put $1 million in over time. They wanted us to work with their Nortec division. And I said, well, what the hell do they do? And he said, oh, well, they're doing trans-electrical nerve stimulation devices for treating acute and chronic pain. And I said, I'm thinking, that's a funny parking spot. But anyway, and I said, well, where are they? And they said, San Diego. And I said, where the hell is that? Now, I knew a nephrologist there, Lee Henderson at UCSD, and that was it. And when I hadn't been there. And so we cut a deal with Medtronic, and we had about $1 million worth of Medtronic equipment with Medtronic labels in it. And they didn't sell a goddamn thing because, unfortunately, when the deal was cut, there was some New Zealand physician came out with a publication in the New England Journal of Medicine saying that a 325 milligram aspirin was just as good as a $1,000 TENS device. So they weren't selling too many TENS devices, and they forgot about our stuff. Mm-hmm. So we finally bought the business back they'd invested $1 million in us, and by May of 1992, that was in 1990, and by 92, we're going out backwards, and I flew to the Twin Cities and sat down with the guys at Medtronic at Fridley. And Glenn Nelson was the guy who was a general surgeon who was working full-time for Medtronic. Wonderful guy, by the way. And I said, you're wrecking our business. He said, well, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I think we're just going to have to buy back our equity. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't see any other way out of it, Glenn. He said, okay, why don't you go get a cup of coffee and come back in 45, 50 minutes. So I came back, and he said, he said, we can do it. He said, it's all yours for $2 million. I said, wait a minute. I said, 18 months, you've nearly sent us broke, and you want 100% return on your investment. And he says, hey, by the way, congratulations on what you've been doing there in Europe and Southeast Asia. He said, we think the business is worth $10 million, and we invested at $1 million. So congratulations on what you're doing, but it's yours for $2 million.
So you at this time already had a commercial sleep apnea product.
We were selling.
What was the market like back then? You'd actually never answer my question of how serious this is and why is it so underappreciated. I would just parenthetically point out. But
David, I was waiting for you to come back at me.
Okay. So so how? Where were we in terms of treating sleep apnea and?
This was so ridiculously novel that it I can remember discussions with Colin where he said, listen, I suspect this causes hypertension, but we don't have the data. And of course now it's the #1 cause on the NIH website, and it has been for 10 years. You'd think the trenches would be manned.
Right.
But so back to your question on the prevalence. In fact, an article recently came out. Atul Malhotra, who's the head of pulmonary critical care and sleep medicine at UCSD, was one of the co-authors who came out in Lancet Respiratory, and based on a study in Lausanne in Switzerland. And they took people coming into the giant hospital system there, and the guy, the first author is Heinze, and worked at Harvard when Atul was at Harvard. And they just simply took people virtually coming into any part of the hospital system, and they said, listen, we'd like to do sleep studies on you to determine what the prevalence was. At an apnea-hypopnea index of 15 per hour, which is roughly where you'd start treating, they found that the prevalence in males was 50%, and for females it was 23%. This is a monster public health problem, bigger than, I mean, you could add up malaria, HIV, AIDS, Hep C, Hep B, add them all up and you wouldn't even reach the carnage that's caused by untreated, undiagnosed, of course, and therefore untreated.
So if it's 50% prevalence, what percent actually get treatment right now?
In the US,
is it in single digits?
It's probably at 10.
Wow.
Yeah. And the rest of the world, of course, you're not even close to that.
So you talked about how it's so much greater medical problem than some of these other conditions. What are the implications, though, of untreated sleep apnea? I mean, for those in the audience who haven't been tested where they've got sleep apnea, what are the risks of not treating apnea? Sleep apnea?
Well, they're catastrophic. First of all, mention hypertension. So if you look at various medical comorbidities, stroke, 75% of patients with stroke, or even a transient ischemic attack, it's 75% prevalence. Of all patients visiting a general cardiologist, often it's AFib, it's 50%. Major depressive disorder, 75%, and the shrinks aren't even doing sleep tests. I mean, it's ridiculous. Diabetes, type 2 diabetes, not necessarily associated with BMI. It's over 75%. It causes metabolic syndrome. It causes cognitive dysfunction. It causes impotence. I mean, car accidents, workplace accidents because of sleep deprivation.
So have you, as Resmed or others in the field, ever done studies to figure out why it is so undertreated? And is it that patients aren't aware? Is it that there's something about it that they don't want to treat? I mean, I want to get in a moment to the technology of the devices itself. But if it's such a major health problem, is it just unawareness, or is there resistance?
You know, it probably goes back years and years. I mean, if you think a physician treating a patient, it'll be, listen, I want you to have a good night's sleep and I'll see you in the morning. And it should be, I'll see you in the morning if you get there. You know, the bottom line is, and in fact, I remember being with Bill Dement, and I think it was, I mean, years ago, Bill in Japan, and Bill put up the triumvirate of health, like just a circle with good nutrition, and even the kids in the dysfunctional K through 12 California system understand that, you know, probably high fiber, low fat makes sense, and physical activity, everybody knows that if you're physically active, better yet physically fit, but you work better, you sleep better, and then you have sleep. And unless, as Bill pointed out, unless your sleep is healthy, you cannot be healthy. And I have plagiarized that. No, it's not plagiarized. I've given Bill credit for it. So it's not real plagiarization. But it is curious that it affects every single medical silo, including gynecology with preeclampsia. The women have sleep disordered breathing. It's not frank apnea, but they're hypertensive, proteinuria, and if you treat the sleep disordered breathing, they go through to a normal term delivery.
So 30 years.
And I mean, Raphael could tell you how are you going here with the gynecologists and. I mean, it's just, and you talk to endocrinologists. I mean, 75% of the patients with type 2 diabetes have it, and they're not even doing sleep tests. I actually don't get it. I'm not quite sure. We set up a foundation, and so we you know, a few $1 million a year in research grants around the world, from Essen to Edinburgh to Harvard to wherever, and you know, we have a scientific advisory board to decide which grants should be funded and so forth. But it befuddles me. It really does. I mean,
So $2 billion company, 30 years in, does it still feel like a missionary sell to you project?
Absolutely. It's a marathon, and we're just lacing our shoes.
Great. So I want to talk about some of the issues that Resmed is facing, some of the very interesting strategies the company's pursuing. But just to finish, so Tom had mentioned they've got a $9 billion market valuation.
Well, Tom was a little bit off the mark, but it's about 9.5 billion.
9.5 billion.
But I could check today's. I mean,
You don't tell me you. I can't believe you haven't already checked today.
well, I'm not selling.
But
so-
you went public in '95
Yes.
at an $85 million valuation.
Yes, that's true.
Yes.
Yeah.
Why did you go public at that time?
Oh,
and if the problem is so underappreciated, was that a factor or is that an issue in your public offering? Did people
at the
really
time?
get what this opportunity was all about?
No, they wouldn't have had a clue at that time. I can remember going on the circuit when we were trying to sell the IPO, and the Merrill Lynch guys were kind of laughing about it. But I said, "This is bigger than Ben-Hur," and I throw that back to them. Anyway, the market cap today was 9.73 billion, Tom. But so you can
You're lopping off.
change your reference point there.
You're lopping off almost 10%.
And we're
So before we get to the current thing, Mick was
48 cents today, for those of you that are interested.
Mick was going to be here, but just I know that he's the CEO, and I know that he obviously has a relationship with the founder, but he had a career before Resmed. What was Mick doing before he joined Resmed, and why and under what circumstances, and how did you bring him into Resmed?
Well, he, like me, he did undergrad chemical engineering, and he, about 100 years later, also got a scholarship to MIT. So he was in the what's known as the LGO program, the Leaders for Global Organisation. So he did a master's in chemical engineering and an MBA at Sloan at MIT, and then worked for Arthur D. Little, the consulting mob in Boston. And about 14 years ago, called me up, and it was like, how could my old man be running a company that made sense? And I said, well, I got news for you. I'm not into nepotism, but there were a couple of jobs going in business development. So he snagged one of those, and then he became head of business development, and then he became a head of US marketing, and then he became head of US Americas, Resmed Americas, which was around 800 million in revenues, etc. But when I decided, I mean, I didn't have any blood in the urine or anything, but I thought, well, before I get pushed, I'll step down, and so we used Spencer Stewart, and they had an article in the Harvard Business Review sometime in 2010 where they looked at 300 CEO appointments over a 5-year period. And, what worked, what didn't work. And they came up with some bleedingly obvious results, but they had real data. And they said if you had a company which had a good strategy being well executed, you were 3 times better off promoting from within.
Right.
On the other hand, if you had a company that had hit the rocks and you promoted from within, that's exactly where you'd stay, on the rocks. So we pulled them in, and this was a 2-year process. I mean, so we had about 5,000 employees at the time, so we ended up with 15, and so I sat down with the Spencer Stewart guys and said, here's the characteristics that we're looking for, and they got down to 15 people, and then after a year, we were down to 2, Mick and another guy who was an electrical engineer with an MBA with distinction, and they said both of them need training wheels, so there was a 6-month coaching program. So at the end of 18 months, we were ready to call it, and then the board said, well, we've got to go externally. And the problem with that is that you bring somebody in, it looks like St. Paul the Apostle, and you go, oh my God, what have we done? But you bring somebody in, you've got to pay off all their RSUs and options and move them and so forth. And then if you got the wrong person, so then the board said, well, let's go internally, and then Mick got the nod over Rob Douglas, and Rob stayed on as president and COO. So we wanted to keep him, and we were able to do it.
And when did Mick become CEO?
2013, yeah, I guess it got it.
So relatively recently.
Yeah.
So I want to get into some of the things that Resmed is doing right now, because I think they're doing some things that really resonate with the medtech industry right now. But just, I guess, as reflected in Resmed's revenues, is this a global issue? Is this a issue treated predominantly in the U.S., in Europe? Your early Baxter career was mostly in Asia. What's the geographic dispersion or treatment pattern for sleep apnea?
Well, we've seen no differences in various geographies between the prevalence values.
Epidemiologically, the Asian population is likely to get
essentially the same. There are minor differences, but not enough to change the prevalence numbers. And it's an educational thing. It's what we did. In fact, last month we announced this. Dr. Oz, excuse me, somebody forgot to turn my phone off. I don't know how that happened. So he was interested in. We have a device called an S Plus, which is about as big as this, and it's a radar device that sits on the side of the bed, and it's 7 to 10 gigahertz, and the reflected wave comes back, and we use Doppler analysis, and we can get sleep staging, REM sleep, non-REM, but also slow wave, awake sleep, etc.
That's a diagnostic.
Right. You get a histogram, and it Bluetooths into your iPhone or your Android.
Right.
And it will give you right through the night. In fact, you can get single breaths, etc. But it gives you a sleep efficiency, how you compare with people of your age and body habitus, etc. And it's highly specific and sensitive. And Dr. Oz ran a whole hour program on it, and then approached us. And he's actually a cardiac surgeon at Columbia. Mehmet Oz, and he put his own money in, so he's got 10% of this entity, and it's called Sleep Scores Lab, and it's set up in Carlsbad, and we moved some of our people into the entity, and so that's going to be the direct-to-consumer push. But the S Plus is really a diagnostic, although we just recommend, it's not FDA approved because we didn't want it to be FDA approved.
So Resmed owns 90% of that?
No, we own 45%, and there's a private equity firm in New York that owns that we're friendly with Oz.
So the point I've been leading up to is as you guys are moving forward, I know that health informatics, sleep, consumerism, wellness social media is part of your strategy to get the message out. Why not do that within the context of wholly owned by Resmed instead of sharing it? Yeah,
that's a good question. The delicacy of channel conflict. Mm-hmm. And so in the US, 95% of our business goes through durable medical equipment suppliers. And if you look like you're competing with them, they get all bent out of shape and so forth. So this is a separate entity. Although the S Plus we sell on our website. You can buy it on Apple, you can buy it on Amazon, and it's $100, and it sits beside your bed, and you can use it for your own diagnosis. But it's that's not a threat to them. But the Sleep Scores Lab is meant to be direct to consumer, and they in fact could be marketing CPAPs as well.
But direct-to-consumer seems to be central to your strategy going forward. I know in investor presentations, Resmed talks about end-to-end solutions with 2 million cloud-connected medical devices producing data daily. Talk a little bit about where that social media, that outreach to consumers fits in a company. And just before we got started, you talked about Resmed not so much as a medical technology company, but as a service, software as service company. That has to be an evolution for you. Where is Resmed thinking about that right now?
We now it's significantly above 2 million. I think we're close to 2.7 million every night. People which are cloud-enabled, so that there's a chip in all the devices we sell. We made that investment about 3.5 years ago, roughly, and we've been growing like topsy. So we just recently, a couple of weeks ago, had our 1 billionth night of data collected. I mean, this is just a monstrous way to get enormous amount of data on patients being treated.
And what do you do with that data?
The patient can get there's an app we have called MyAir, and then the DMEs, the durable medical equipment guys, and the caretakers also have access to this database, so you can manage your patient groups by exception. We also bought a company in Georgia, Atlanta, called Brightree, which works with all the payers, the Cignas and the Humanas and so forth, plus CMS. So it does all the billing. So the DME doesn't have to hire a phalanx of people to sit on the phone with various insurers and also the co-pays. Virtually none of them are getting co-pays, whereas the computer, of course, is just going to keep going. So it reduces the cost of doing business by something like 60% for the DMEs. And they get live information and information by exception as to which patients need attention, if they got a leak or they're not using the machine appropriately, etc. So it checks for whether the patient's being compliant or not, adherent to the device. So and we charge per patient per month.
And is that ultimately going to be the way people will treat sleep apnea, or is this a more limited project for a smaller group of patients? I guess the issue is if this is an underappreciated, undertreated population, as you begin to do that, does everybody who recognize that they have sleep apnea embrace this kind of technology, or are you still rolling it out for the patient?
We're still rolling it out. I mean, it's got incredible acceptance. I mean, it's you know, a rough estimate, we've probably got 55% of the world's market, and this approaching 60%. To give you an idea of scale, we sell 750,000 masks a month and 250,000 devices, and we literally haven't started.
Because of the low penetration rate.
Because of the low penetration. But since you've got basically a computer on the side of your bed, you can think about how you could use that with data from other sensors, if you like, and put that up into the cloud. So it's, you know, the potential is, you know, just whatever your imagination is. And the things are very accurate and reliable, and we're delighted I mean, it was a substantial investment, but we are delighted we did it.
So how much of the expansion of the market will come through a direct appeal to consumers? How much is this about reaching out to primary care physicians? And what's the role of a sleep specialist in treating, in advancing treatment of sleep apnea? It seems to me that the sleep specialist is critical, but may only see a fraction of the patients who have sleep apnea and need this kind of treatment. What's your target audience?
Yeah, well, I mean, the prevalence figures that I spoke about, 50% of males and 23% of females, I mean, it's a huge, huge problem. I mean, sleep physicians don't want to be seeing garden variety sleep disordered breathing. I mean, why? I mean, when you look at something like insomnia, which affects 40% of people, and you know, there are many other. There are something like 90 different sleep disorders. Why would you be spending all your 85% of your time on one simple disorder, which you could push onto the internist or family physicians? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. And when the numbers get up, you'd be begging for help.
Right.
So I mean, it's an enormous problem that ought to be addressed at the internist level.
So is this a primary care physician?
It's a primary care play. It ought to be a problem. And then you go to the sleep physician when you've got a real problem.
And have you built a sales force to reach primary care physicians, or how does Resmed reach that customer base?
It depends on the geography. Now, we're direct to patient in, say, for example, in Germany, whereas in the US, 95% of our business is through the DMEs. and they don't want to even give out warranty cards.
Right.
Because they don't want the patients making direct contact with us. And it's ironic that I see patients all the time. And they say, and I say, well, you on one of our devices? Oh, I think so. So they've got to actually go and check the device and then email me and say, yeah, no, it is one of yours, or no, it's one of the other guys. It's hard to get branding where the DMEs have 95% of the market and they want everything to go through them, right, because it's the repeat masks and the tubing and all the filters and everything else, and they want it all through them, of course.
So lack of awareness or lack of understanding of the severity of sleep disorder is one issue for sleep apnea companies and Resmed in particular. To what extent is reimbursement? Do reimbursers understand the cascade, the implications of the cascade of health problems if this condition is not treated early on, or do you fight reimbursement battles all the time?
No, well, again, we're not the ones fighting those battles. That's the DMEs and the HMEs. So we give them whatever information we can that we think will help them. Our medical director and I, Glenn Richards, have just submitted a paper to Translational Medicine called The Holy Grail of Healthcare. And that is the treatment and the diagnosis, treatment and management of sleep disordered breathing, because it improves, and I could throw I could allow Dr. Palau and Dr. Krieger and Dr. Dement to opine on this, but quality of life just goes through the roof with patients who are adherent. The second thing is it reverses the deterioration in the comorbidities, like metabolic syndrome, which eventually will lead you to type 2 diabetes if the SDB is untreated. It causes hypertension, a cognitive disorder, nocturia, getting up a lot at night to take a pee, and so on and so forth. All this carnage and accelerated aging because of somatotropins not produced, etc., without the slow wave sleep and so forth. And then the third thing is it saves bucket loads of money, the overuse of hospital and medical services. And we've funded a fishing expedition, if you like, with the Kaiser Foundation. And in literally hundreds of thousands of patients, we've shown less use of pharmacologic agents, hospital services, etc. So the data are all there. So once this Holy Grail publication of mine and Glenn's gets out there, the world will change, I'm sure.
So I think we would be remiss if we didn't raise one issue that is often raised about sleep apnea in general, and that is that one reason due to one of the reasons behind lack of compliance is that the devices are cumbersome and uncomfortable to wear. Is that a myth? Is that true? To what extent are your R&D efforts focused, or your efforts generally focused on, continue to be focused on new technology design?
Well, if you look at the evolution, and nowadays, the latest data we have, we're people that are physicians and the infrastructure that understand are doing a good job, we're seeing compliance of 87%. And it's up from the mid-40s if you go back far enough. And so compliance is not, and the latest, the AirSense 10 auto set of ours, I mean, the noise level is 24 decibels. I mean, not even your dog can hear it.
Right.
And if you're a patient, it's noise, the comfort, and everything else. And the noise is now at a level where, unless you've got a leaky mask or something, it's just not even your bed partner can hear it. And it's not actually not an issue.
That's an old issue.
It's an old issue.
Craig's issue.
Yep.
So we're not really looking for.
I mean, and you've got other options. I mean, you've got mandibular repositioning devices, in which one of which we sell, called a Narval, which is made from composite nylon. So you get an intraocular scan, not a mold of your mouth. I mean, that's the old way of doing it. But you get an intraocular scan of your mouth, send it to us. We CAD-CAM it, 3D print this mandibular repositioning device called a Narval, and you adjust it yourself. There are nylon bushings, so until you start to feel temporomandibular joint problem, TMJ problems, it'll move your mandible, your lower jaw forward, until you feel as though it's pressurizing it, and it'll stop snoring like no tomorrow.
So-
mild levels, that works perfectly.
So we're here at Stanford in the really kind of the epicenter of startups and innovative medical technology. Is there a lot of activity at the startup level, independent of Resmed and Respironics, around sleep apnea? Is this a problem in which, if one went searching, we would find dozens of startups working on the problem, or is there relatively little activity around this?
Well, today we're talking with Dr. Crummell and the rest of the team, and the new Biodesign students, and some of them that were prior Biodesign students. And I mean, there are 41 areas of focus, and 3 of them were presented today, which are right in line with respiratory medicine. I mean, one was asthma, which a lot of the problems are nocturnal asthma, which can be triggered by sleep disorder breathing, and a ventilator, which with applications to places like India in particular, but also China and Africa and so forth, and a ventilator that's cheap that does the job effectively, and that was called One Breath. And I'm skipping the other one. What was the other one? I've got good notes though. What? Lully. Yeah, Lully for kids. The night terrors. I get night terrors, but I'm not a kid. But this was very interesting, and I didn't realise that 1.4 million kids in this country suffer from night terrors, which is a kind of a big number. And you can disturb and it happens in stage 3. So if you wake the kid up and then allow them to go back into sleep, apparently in 75% of the cases the night terrors are reduced. So there are 3 areas that we'd like to follow up on.
So you talked before about the comorbidities and all the associated health problems that come with sleep apnea.
They're massive.
Stroke, AFib, diabetes, obesity, heart failure, drug-resistant hypertension.
Yep.
As you think about Resmed going forward, can you see yourself evolve? How do you see yourself positioning from a technology perspective, Resmed, with those other conditions? Do you see those as partners? Do you see those as natural opportunities to go into those other adjacencies? You still have a lot of opportunity in, in
I
sleep
think
apnea for penetrating the market.
given the fact that the penetration is so low, even here, it's getting the word out that, I mean, that this is not a cost, it's actually a cost saving.
Right.
And so that message needs to be gotten out. And the hypertensionologists and the endocrinologists, the diabetologists, the gynecologists, I mean, with the preeclampsia and things like that, the message, it's not up to us. We can get the message out in a fashion, but we can't do a fabulous job of that unless people within, like cardiologists, ought to be doing sleep tests. I mean, it's just shrinks ought to be doing sleep tests. I mean, given the fact that 75% of major depressive disorder, the patients have sleep disordered breathing that's undiagnosed, and that's what's causing the depression. I mean,
Could you envision a time when Resmed began to get into and market technologies in areas like heart failure or drug-resistant hypertension, or would you leave that to other plays?
It's not immediately clear to me, given how underpenetrated things are. That wouldn't be, be kind of like flipping priorities, if you like. There might be an opportunity to do that. It's not immediately obvious to me right now that we need to play a role there.
We're right up against time. I notice we don't have microphones, but perhaps this room is small enough if you have, we do have a microphone in the back, so if we have questions, we'll take them in a second. We've got one back here. Let me just, actually, let's take this question now, and then I'll follow up with my last question when we're done with the Q&A period.
Thank you for being here.
Pleasure.
There's a fair amount of data showing that there's a very large installed base of CPAP, BiPAP machines out there. Most sources will tell you that they're very much underutilized, and the 80% compliance rates that you report are is certainly encouraging, but it seems unlikely that that's sustained for very long. And I wouldn't want all the engineers in the room thinking that the problems of tolerability have actually been solved and everyone can just go home.
So you're
These
making,
mach- these
you're making the
machines-
argument that there's still design problems as far as
This is what you hear in the clinics, is that you can't tolerate them for various reasons. So my question is what barriers remain in terms of tolerability that can give all the engineers in this room hope of actually improving this device rather than just letting it sell itself?
Yeah, Dr. Palaio had his hand up, and as a clinician, he might want to make a comment about that.
Can we get
but-
the microphone over here?
There's a lot of misconceptions about CPAP. CPAP's never been better. We're the golden era of CPAP now.
You mean in terms of product design or compliance?
Yeah, storage of efficacy. A lot of times the machine is not set correctly, and that's the problem. If you just grab a pair of glasses from a bin, don't expect to have 20/20 vision. But there are companies like SleepQuest right here that has over 90% compliance with their patients. So the key is the follow-up. What happens is a lot of the people what they're doing is they just buy machines and don't have any follow-up, and that's the issue. It's like I see you get a pair of shoes and they don't fit you, then they sit in the closet. If CPAP's set correctly, there won't be a problem. So 80% is an easy compliance number to hit if they have the proper follow-up. It's never gotten better. There's going to be more stuff to do, and there are more
Yeah,
complex machines. But I think, the problem is more ignorance about CPAP and not the engineering of the device.
Yeah. Now, I mean, your point's well taken. I mean, it's not that you stop doing R&D. I mean, of course, you keep going. And I'll give you an example. We will in a few months we'll have a CPAP which is about that big, with the humidifier, and the humidifier is actually a heat and moisture exchanger. So you screw it in and you change it every 30 days. So it collects the moisture from your breath and then gives it back to you. So, but you need to exchange it. But it's literally, it's that big, an Air Mini. So you got to almost put it in your pocket. So for travel and so forth,
Right.
it's perfect.
But-
But to Raphael's point, I mean, if the patient, anybody who, and 90% of what we sell now is fully automatic. In other words, you get the pressure you need at the nair, so there's a feedback system in the device. And in addition to that, you have a chip. So this comes back to the physician, it comes back to the patient, and it goes back to the DMEs. So the patients know, you know exactly what's happening every single night. So if you go back without that kind of information, then you wouldn't know who wasn't using their devices.
But Raphael, just to follow up on that point, the notion that patients who are diagnosed as needing a sleep apnea device, CPAP device, take one home, try it for a couple of nights, don't like it, and stop using it, you think is if not just grossly exaggerated, it's not accurate.
It happens, but it's lack of proper follow-up care. It's not the
Okay.
machine's fault.
Right.
It's not set correctly.
Okay.
That's the problem. Because the money isn't filling the machine, not taking care of the patient.
Right.
It's the outcomes is the problem. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah, I'd like to make some comments. So I spent about 30 years in Winnipeg in Canada, and I have to say that I met this gentleman who came up to see me and my patients probably about 1990 or something like that. And so he actually got in
1890 it was,
1890. And so the company has always sort of gotten in touch with doctors and patients, and that's been a really important part. Now, one of the things I want to emphasize about the current technology is that a lot of the information from the machine goes to the cloud, and therefore the doctor can actually see how the patient is doing and also adjust the equipment back to the machine to adjust it so that things work a lot better.
That's the end-to-end solution. Is that
It's an
that
end-to-end
means
solution.
that data goes back to doctors?
Yeah, it goes back to the doctors, and it also goes to the patient. In other words, the patient knows every single morning when they get up how they did the night before.
Yep.
And the machine will tell them whether they need a new mask, whether there's a leak, whether they're not being treated properly. And so, for example, we will see patients who are on the wrong machine. In other words, there are many different kinds of PAPs, positive airway pressure devices, and some patients are on the wrong machine, on the wrong pressure, and we can fix all that stuff, and if you fix it, the compliance rate goes way up, probably into the 80s.
And why does that happen? Why do patients find themselves with the wrong device or a device that's
Well, for
properly-
example, we talk mostly about obstructive sleep apnea. Okay, there are other forms of sleep apnea, for example, central sleep apnea, where they stop breathing not because of an obstruction, but because the information from the brain is telling them not to breathe as much. That happens, for example, in most people who are on opiate painkillers. They develop something called complex sleep apnea, and they need a different type of device entirely. So, and they actually may be made worse by CPAP. It's plain CPAP. So, so it's not simply giving somebody a machine. You have to follow them. You have to see how they're doing, and then make adjustments.
Yep, totally agree.
well, there's two other, one here and then three.
So I have a view that's a tiny bit different. So I think the machine have improved tremendously, and it's absolutely true that it's much more comfortable. And indeed, I think it's also very true that the key is that very often the system has been set up so that all the clinical practices are making money by just diagnosing patients and getting them out of the door as soon as possible. Whereas almost all the key to success is to fine-tune, to make sure that they're comfortable, that they have the right pressure, the right machine, to coach them, to accept the treatment. And that's not being done because it's not well covered by insurance. So that's one problem. It's a chronic disease. It's not a disease that you should just treat by just giving a machine and say goodbye.
Well, wouldn't the sensor-based connectivity help address that significantly?
It does. I think it helps, but I think it's not sufficient. Exactly the same problem as with insomnia. We have a lot of behavioral techniques for insomnia that are quite effective. But if people go online and use the apps online that do sleep restriction, etc., the compliance is not so good. It's like if tomorrow I tell you go and exercise 20 miles every day, you're not going to do it. But if I'm your good friends and I go with you and I exercise every day for a while, maybe that's going to change. So I think there's the human component. I think is very important in helping patients to tolerate the machine, to get used to it, to follow the advice. And that's not something we do very well, in my opinion.
Are you a physician?
Yeah.
Great.
Yeah.
So we had.
And
The head of the sleep clinic.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Dr. Mignot.
So we have one question there and one question here next.
And I didn't mean to be not complimentary about psychiatrists. That was
Did you say something uncomplimentary about psychiatrists?
Dr. Mignot is a psychiatrist. Yeah.
Oh, I see. You're a psychiatrist, so is this a as much a mental issue as a physiological?
So I think obviously it's like everything. I mean, it's not just
One thing.
Yeah.
just to say it's not easy. Behavioral changes are very difficult.
Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to step on your question.
No problem. You mentioned that your firm, your company, made a significant investment in chipping everything and making sure that there was a closed loop. I spent the first 25 years of my career designing and shipping product out the door. Now, as an independent person, I do a lot of cybersecurity work. And it scares the bejesus out of me because when I go in and find people that are doing bad things, it is less often because of money and more often because they're bad people. How much of your investment takes into account infrastructure or just the being aware of it and working on the security? Because it's not just the
You
data.
mean specifically around
Yeah,
cybersecurity?
in the channels.
Cybersecurity? Big
that
issue?
well, it's becoming a big issue because somebody raised the point exactly as you did, and we're diving into the weeds right now about that whole issue, and it's a very good point.
What would be
And
the,
I don't have a clear.
what would be the danger of cybersecurity? I mean, in other words, what do I care if someone hacks my CPAP?
Well, you can interfere with the treatment. Yeah. so you can start wiping people
Well,
out,
certainly cybersecurity is something
Yeah.
we're hearing more about.
which is not what the plan would be.
Thank you so much. So I'm with an early stage VC fund, and we look at the sleep space quite a lot. We see a lot of applications and things that track your sleep, but don't necessarily make that big impact. Just curious what
Have you
areas.
made any investments since?
We haven't yet.
You haven't seen that's
One
part
of the
the problem.
companies you mentioned earlier that you looked at through Biodesign may be one that we're in diligence right now in. But curious what areas and innovations in the sleep space excite you that have not been resolved yet.
Well, you know, going back, one of the big challenges is it's such an enormous problem, and yet the penetration is so low. So anything that can improve the penetration, the awareness, has got to be moving in the right direction. And the biodesign programs here, you know, with anything to do with sleep. I mean, you know, the night terrors, and that was just children. That's 1.5 million. And then asthma, and in this case nocturnal asthma, that's another hugely important area, because it costs lots and lots of money if it's not addressed. I mean, it's huge.
What's your M&A? What's your posture toward M&A? I mean, when you think about the area spaces you'd like to get into and the technologies you'd like to advance, do you see those coming through internal R&D, or do you see, is Resmed an active acquirer of new technologies? I mean, you talked about the Georgia company, which it seems more of a service play.
Yep. Well, we've made several dozen investments in companies, and it's either areas that we target and then look to see if there's anybody out there doing that stuff we're interested in, or people that just come to us. I mean, it's just the ebb and flow. I mean,
And
it
those
goes.
are minority investments?
Correct. So we'll take a sub 20% equity.
Right.
And then as we come down the curve of proof, and the valuation goes up. In other words, if you reduce the risk, the valuation's going to go up. So we've invested at, say, a valuation of under 10 million, and we've paid over 100 million for the company. But we're happy to.
But is your assumption, doing those minority investments, that Resmed will eventually acquire those companies, or you're just trying to get a look at novel technologies at an early stage?
We generally make that investment when we're thinking about acquiring, but it could be years later. Yeah.
One last question.
Sure.
There is a
Yeah.
company actually in our building. I'm with a company called Plug and Play, Bianca Med, that was acquired by Resmed.
Correct.
Sure, out of Ireland.
Yeah.
Any fun stories to share about that company?
Any fun stories? One of the guys that when we bought, that's now Resmed Sensor Technology. So that S Plus, all that technology came out of Bianca Med. And so we've got a proper diagnostic system out of that. Plus we have this consumer-based S Plus. I think you can buy one for $100. And it's a good
you must see
investment.
virtually
It's a good
every new technology that comes in.
You know, we pretty much do. We've got a very active M&A group. And the Bianca Med was, that was close to 8 years before we ended up buying that. But we already owned 15% of it, so the rest of it was only 85%.
You did that, what, around 2011, 2012?
Yeah, 2011.
Yeah. So I'll tell you a story about that later.
But and there were 3 guys that came with that. One was a chemical engineer, a Dublin guy, University College Dublin. The other was an electrical engineer, University College Dublin. One of them did his PhD at Columbia, the other at Penn. And then they postdoced in the US, and then they were the founders of the company. One of the guys, both named Connor, common name in Ireland, but one of them joined Fitbit, and the other guy was with us for a while and then left. But the commercial guy is the guy who's the CEO of this Sleep Scores lab that we talked about with Dr. Oz, Colin Lawler.
Yeah. So we're right up against time. I just want to ask you one other question. It's a very interesting technology space. Can you just give us a sense of the competitive landscape and as you look forward, and look to Resmed's growth, will it come through expanding the market, taking market share from competitors, adding new technologies? Where does growth for Resmed come in?
You
the
know,
future?
it's kind of all of the above. It's a sort of unpredictable. It's, you know, I mean, last quarter we grew at 17%, which at our size, I mean, the quarter was 530 million bucks, and our operating cash flow was 120 million for just the last quarter, which is not bad. So we're in pretty good shape. And we've got $1 billion cash.
And your main competition is still Respironics?
Respironics, well, it's Philips.
Now owned by
'cause
Philips.
It's owned by Philips now.
Any of the major multinationals?
No,
in
there's
this space?
a small New Zealand company called Fisher and Paykel, who make a reasonable device. They got a problem because with us being chip enabled, etc., and it's difficult for them, I think, to be competitive. I mean, they make reasonable products, and generally they sell on the basis of cost. But so we would have something like 55% of the world market, and the other guys maybe 40. Respironics.
And then the
or
rest made
Philips.
up by the others.
Yeah.
Well, it's been absolutely fascinating. I apologize for running over, but this has been, I think, a really interesting talk. Let's thank Peter for coming
Pleasure.
today and
Thank you.
sharing his insights with the Biodesign Fellows.
Thank you.
And I think there's a reception outside, so we invite you to that reception. Thank you.
All right.